Let's say you get an A on an exam. You would attribute this to your own knowledge or awesomeness. However, if you were to get a bad grade on that same test, you might blame the teacher for the lack of explanation on that topic or that the test was unfair. This is very common for students, athletes, and workers. I've seen this personally with athletes who they perform poorly when their season comes around and they blame it on the fact that there was poor weather or that it just wasn't their day. But in fact, they didn't put all the effort in during the preseason to actually make their season worth it. But they'll blame it on external factors rather than taking the negativity to themselves. This is called the self-serving bias, and it is defined as people's tendency to attribute positive events to their own character, but attribute negative events to external factors. Uh, I'm an athlete at Rice University, and the idea of this self-serving bias comes up very often. Like I said earlier, with the athletes, um, it is it is a problem that affects a lot of them, and this is why I'm going to be talking about it today. So, being aware of this self-serving bias is important to having the right thought process. Today, I'm going to tell you how the self-serving bias affects learning, self-enhancement, and self-presentation. So let's take a closer look at my first point, which is learning, and how it is affected by the self-serving bias. Learning can be negatively affected by the self-serving bias. I think with the introduction of participation trophies specifically, especially in the Western world, it can actually negatively affect the kids, especially in a losing scenario when one team clearly beats the other. By giving these kids the trophies or the participation, medals, ribbons, whatever it may be, they're making the kids forget and ignore their part in the negative event of losing. This can be detrimental in the learning process because now the kids will start to think that if they lose, it has nothing to do with um, with them and it is out of their control. This passes the blame onto an external factor, which can affect the kids' entire lives. Now that they are trained for this behavior, it will repeat for the rest of their lives, and they won't realize this behavior at all. They might not realize it for their whole life. They could go their whole life not knowing that they're actually doing something wrong. Uh, Another example of this would be in a relationship. If the relationship is broken up and it's clearly somebody's fault, the person that is at fault might actually say that this person was crazy or it wasn't in my control. Again, tossing the blame to an external control rather than taking it themselves. If they continue to ignore responsibility when something negative happens, it will not only hurt the relationships, but they can affect learning just as participation trophies do. They won't learn from their mistakes because they don't think they are the ones that caused them. Now that I've talked about learning, I'm going to talk about self-presentation with the self-serving bias. Self-presentation is thought to be a motivation with the self-serving bias. It's one of two. So the first one is self-presentation, and it is how one presents himself to other people. This self-serving bias helps us maintain the image that we present to others. So someone might claim that they get a good grade on an exam because of their own efforts, and if they perform poorly, they could say that they studied all night, but the questions didn't cover the material given. They're just throwing it out the window that it could have been their fault. In this case, they claim personal responsibility for their success, but not for their failures. Is seen all the time. I see it all the time when I'm in school. This helps shape how people see them, and with the self-serving bias in mind, people can essentially shape how they want to be viewed. This can be very dangerous in the long term. For an example, if someone is getting into a relationship or if they're looking for a roommate, um, they might see how people present themselves, but it's not until you get to know that person on a deep personal level that you see all their little nicks and all their problems. Now that I've talked about self-presentation, I'm going to talk about self-enhancement with the self-serving bias. Self-enhancement is thought to be a motivation with the self-serving bias. This is the second one. So self-enhancement is the need to keep one's self-worth. It's exactly what it sounds like. An individual that uses the self-serving bias will attribute positive things to their own character and negative things to outside forces to maintain their positive self-image of themselves. A good example of this would be to say you're a good hitter in baseball, but you strike out all three times. Um, you might say that the umpire unfairly called the strikes. So this would help you maintain the idea that you're a good hitter when in reality, you missed the strikes. It happens. You missed the pitches. Um, Another good example of this was to look at a political debate. This happens all the time. There's constantly um, voting sessions. Every 4 years, we have to pick a new president, so this is a very common topic for us. Supporters of competing political candidates watch the same debate, and yet each side thinks their side wins. In order to keep their own self-image and worth, if there is a topic that they believe they know about, but the opposing side says otherwise, um, it brings up solid evidence against the argument, they still might deny it and think that they're wrong. And it might bring up something else to completely take the topic away from what the opposing side is talking about. That's preserving their self-image and self-enhancement. So in conclusion, being aware of the self-serving bias is important to making the right decisions. A negative to this bias is that if someone is depressed, the actions are flipped. So they take negative actions for their own character and positive or external. And this is a really bad slippery slope that can just make someone more and more depressed. But on the other side, a worker might feel more motivated to look for a job if he attributes his loss of the job to a weak economy. Especially right now, what's going on with the coronavirus, there could be a weak economy coming. It's very unstable right now, and it is important for a lot of these workers to understand that it is not their fault that they lost a job. And if they keep that in mind, they might be able to keep their head up and keep looking rather than just giving up because they think that they lost because they weren't a good worker. The self-serving bias can affect learning, self-enhancement, and self-presentation if you let it. It is important to know when you are under the influence of the bias to ensure you make the right decisions and best decisions for yourself. Thank you.